Hello, everybody.
Hello.
And welcome. Welcome to the SOA Home Festival. Today's session is Overcoming Imposter Syndrome, and I'm your host, Joanne Harris. This event is part of our autumn-winter season, and it's a 9-week program of online events which runs till the 10th of September 2020. And I'm just going to do a bit of a housekeeping before we move on. Most events are free, but if you can afford to, please consider donating to our Authors Contingency Fund. We're suggesting rather cheekily a minimum donation of £5, but if you've been following what I've been saying on Twitter about the contingency fund and how really urgent it is to address the problems that some authors have who have lost all their livelihood this year because of COVID, then you'll know exactly why I'm saying it. The link will be coming up in the chat very shortly, and the fund is there to support authors in financial difficulty due to the health crisis. So please use the chat function to interact with us, and for posing any questions for the Q&A, which we'll have in the last 20 minutes or so of this session. If you have any streaming issues, and I hope you won't, please press the reconnect button at the top of the screen. And also please browse our virtual Blackwell store, which features books by authors and speakers who are featured in the SOA Home Festival, including from this session. You can make a purchase via the link in the chat, and by doing so, a percentage will go towards the Authors Contingency Fund to help authors in financial need during the current COVID-19 health crisis. So that's that done. I'm going to go back to you and introduce our panelists. It's so good to have you here with us. In order of my screen, we have Joanna Cannon, who you will possibly have heard of from her books, The Trouble with Goats and Sheep and 3 Things About Elsie. She is a force for good on Twitter and elsewhere, particularly, I think, in promoting the idea that working class writers with no background in journalism or the arts can still have a big success. So welcome, Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've also got Nikesh Shukla, who I met on Twitter some years ago because he performed the extraordinary feat of promoting his book Meat Space by projecting into space a piece of tandoori lamb and filming it. He too is a force for good in all kinds of areas. He's a filmmaker. He is the author of at least 5 books that I know of. He is a kind of powerhouse, and he's also the editor of The Good Immigrant, a wonderful collection of essays about race and all kinds of things. It's certainly well worth you looking that up. I've also got Emma Mitchell here, who is a force for good in the world of mental health. I met her first through her lovely book, Making Winter, which was a kind of way of surviving the winter months through making things, through crafting things. And she is a force for good, I think, partly for mental health and also partly in raising awareness about our surroundings, nature, and how important the connection between mental health and our environment and nature really is. So thank you, all of you, for being here. And we're here to talk about Imposter Syndrome, which, looking at the number of you who are tuning in for this, we are not alone in feeling. Now, I think that it's something that most authors feel in some way. And I'd like to start by asking all of you, perhaps, what your experience of imposter syndrome is. Let's start with you, Joanna.
Oh, gosh. Imposter syndrome has followed me for most of my life, I think. I find it in writing, as you say, being an author, which I still find difficult to say. When people say, what do you do? I go, I write books. And also doctoring, when I worked on the wards, I found it really difficult to accept that I'd managed to achieve that. And I got my medical degree and I was working as a doctor. And I remember when they sent the rota through for my first job, I looked across the top of this rota at all the names and it said Dr. Cannon. And I thought, what a coincidence. There's a Dr. Cannon working at Burton Hospital. And I thought, oh my God, that's me. Because I hadn't taken it in that I'd actually managed to achieve that, because it's difficult, I think, when you have imposter syndrome to acknowledge your successes and your achievements. You tend to just filter out the landscape and take in the negative. So it's something that's been with me a long time.
Nikesh?
Yeah, you asked this on a day where I've just started editing a new novel that I finished the first draft a month ago, and so I feel like the worst writer who ever lived today. Reading back this first draft, thinking you cannot edit this into anything. This is terrible. And even though this isn't my first rodeo, as it were, I kind of seem to treat every rodeo like my first rodeo. But yeah, imposter syndrome has sort of followed me around my whole career. I think my whole life. And it is that thing where I'll just sort of draw attention to the obvious just to get out of the way as the only person of color in the kind of the conversation. Like bring a salvation in UK publishing does kind of give you this sort of weird unicorn status where you're hyper visible and hyper invisible at the same time, and both of those things sort of butt up against each other, and you end up just feeling really sort of lost in the maelstrom of it. And I realized kind of my responsibility as a writer of color who some people might have heard of, to kind of be a role model to other writers of color who want to look at spaces and feel like that space can one day belong to them. But that doesn't mean that I'm I'm any more confident in occupying those spaces as I sort of try and project myself to be.
Emma.
Yeah, it is the big question, isn't it? So I started on this path in about 2008. I started a blog in order to make things a little bit less monotonous. I had 2 tiny children at the time, and I also had some difficult family situations. And I started a craft blog, and then noticed that winter was really tough. And so I started to sort of encourage others to join in during winter. And it seemed that sort of colour and just making things and small, simple routines seemed to make people feel a little bit more uplifted. And that carried on. So I started the actual winter project back in about 2010. So it's a whole decade ago. I trained as a scientist, but I hadn't at that point started to read about the research that underpins all this and shows that actually our brain chemistry changes, which it does when we either connect with nature or make things. But I think that the imposter syndrome is with me all the time, and that's probably because I suffer from long-term depression and anxiety, and by their very nature they erode your confidence. They, even if you might be a Nobel Prize winner, if you've got depression hanging around, that voice, that depressive voice, will say you're a pile of, insert rude word here. So it's tricky. Yeah.
I think you did. I think you put your finger on it. I think it's a symptom of a kind of generalized anxiety. I think a lot of writers have it. When I talk about it to people, I find that they often go, well, do you still have it? As if it were dependent on success. And I don't think it is. I think that the secret to imposter syndrome, as opposed to feeling shy or insecure or uncertain whether you're going to make it, is that it doesn't matter at what stage in your career you are. It doesn't matter what you're doing or how well you have done it. There is always that voice going, was it a success? You fluked it. Yeah. Or you got successful because of somebody else. Yeah. Nobody really wants to see you. They want to see the person interviewing you. Nobody really thinks you're a proper writer. They're just being kind. And these are the thoughts that we get. I mean, I think that a lot of people tend to think that imposter syndrome is the same as being critical of yourself. I think you can be legitimately critical. You can legitimately go at that first draft and say, actually, it's not that good. But it's when your first draft has become a completed novel and it's in the charts and people are buying it and you still think, how did that happen? Clearly it was not good enough. Everybody must be talking about it, really. Everybody's being kind. This is the point where you've actually reached peak imposter syndrome. Louise is asking something which I think is actually quite appropriate here. Louise Kelly. She's saying, as authors starting off, we're told to tell ourselves, I am an author. Certainly I tell people to do this. But how do we deal with the friends and the relatives who suggest that doing this is self-aggrandizement, delusional? I say this as someone who isn't published, but who has an agent and who's been long listed for the Dyslexia Prize, but still doesn't know how to respond to that kind of reaction. And actually, I personally think that this is probably at the heart of some of the problems that we develop later on because of this uneasy belief that actually writing isn't a proper job. What do you think? What do the rest of you think?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we see writing as self-indulgent. If you run a marathon or lower your blood pressure or reduce your cholesterol, go to the gym, run the London Marathon, people pat you on the back and say how well you're doing and you're looking after your physical health and isn't it brilliant? But if you do something for your mental health, creating something, writing or painting or photography, anything, people see that as a little self-indulgent, and it's something that you do when you've done everything else. So therefore, as a job, it's the ultimate self-indulgence, according to some people, that they see it as ridiculous. And I can remember once I went on one of these away day things, when I was working on the wards, we had a kind of a get together to try and get to know each other as a ward. And they were asking everybody what they did in their spare time, what they like to do. And I said, oh, I like to write. And people actually sniggered in the room. And I can remember it so clearly.
Really?
Them sniggering at me, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is 10 years ago. And I can remember exactly what it was like. But if people were saying nice things to me on Twitter about my books this morning, I couldn't tell you exactly what they said because I don't absorb that. I absorb the sniggering. So I think anybody who is getting that kind of reaction, there are going to be people in your life that do support you, that are helpful, that are behind you. And you have to give them just as much gravity as you do the people who think it's self-indulgent. That's a very difficult thing because we do filter the landscape to suit our own narrative. So if we're telling ourselves that we're rubbish and nobody really wants us and they're just being kind, and we'll look for evidence in the landscape to support what we think about ourselves. So we take note of these people who think it's self-indulgent and we ignore the people who are behind us and cheering us on. And I think you have to listen to those voices too.
What do you think, Emma? I can see you nodding.
Yeah, I think that I have definitely experienced other people's skepticism and perhaps not quite believing that I was going to make any kind of a career out of it. And people still say, oh, do you know, you're an author? Oh, okay. Do you mean, you know, you're just starting out, or really? And they don't seem to believe me. But what I'd like to sort of say to those people, really, and to ourselves, is two things. Firstly, there is, and I'm always talking about this kind of thing on Twitter, but one thing I'm fascinated by is that reading, now this experiment was fiction. It was based around romantic fiction, things like Georgette Heyer, and sort of not exactly hardcore complex novels or non-fiction. So this was light-hearted romantic fiction, and Daisy Goodwin did a documentary on what it can do to our mental health. Now, she did some experiments measuring cortisol, so it's your stress hormone that we produce in higher levels in a pandemic or any kind of stressful situation. And it's easy to test with saliva. And she had a very busy, high-powered day doing Daisy Goodwin things. I think she's a producer and a writer in television. And she then tested her cortisol before and after, continuing with that, I think, for an extra hour. And then on a different day, before and after, reading Georgette Heyer, literally sort of lying down on a sofa with a cup of tea and some really lovely indulgent, what people might see as indulgent fiction, and her cortisol dropped significantly. So I would like to say to whoever it was in anyone's sort of circle on this, you know, the authors that I'm with here and everybody else, is that this stuff, you know, reading does us good. Literally, it can help us to escape from the horror of, you know, worldwide events right now. And if you can't face reading paper books, then audiobooks can do the same.
Absolutely. And writing too is the same kind of thing.
Oh,
when
yes.
my Fitbit thinks I've gone to sleep. You know,
Yes.
it tells you when you're asleep. My blood pressure drops so much, it actually thinks I'm asleep.
Wow.
How much good it does you, how much relaxing. You're absolutely right.
Well, creative activity of any kind lifts dopamine. So, and that is, of course, something that you get when you look at something beautiful, or, you know, you get a huge bag of chips, or you, I don't know, discover something new, or if you find something that you've been looking for. But creative activity does the same. Your dopamine can rise, and that gives you elation. So if you're solving a bit of a problem with one of your paragraphs or one of your chapters, and you sort of get there, and maybe you go for a cup of tea and don't want to sort of tickle it too much because it might sort of run away. I've had that feeling a lot. And then when you finally get to a structure that you're happy with, you will literally get a burst of dopamine. So we can benefit from making as well as reading.
Yeah, we certainly can. But I do think that sometimes information like this makes it even harder for the skeptics to process what we actually do, because I do think that writing is surrounded by this kind of veil of secrecy and mysticism, and people talk about making magic, and it makes us all sound like wizards. And, you know, we don't feel like wizards at all. Nobody who writes feels like a wizard. We all feel like, you know, the muggle who somehow managed to creep in, and they're surrounded by people who know what they're doing. And I do think that this is one of the causes of how we feel, this imposter syndrome, because we feel we're supposed to have some kind of a magic wand, some kind of, you know, that somebody should have given us a secret at some point during our career, and we were the ones who got missed out. Nikesh, when was the last time, when was the first time you felt imposter syndrome after your success as a writer? Do you even remember, or is it all the time?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Just to kind of sort of tie that into what Joanna and Emily have been saying. I often feel like the thing that gets in my way is forgetting why I'm working on the particular thing that I'm working on, and letting other noises come in. When I'm doing creative writing work with other writers, I'm always getting them to sort of remind themselves of their intentions when it comes to the stuff that they're working on, because the second it comes out, it doesn't belong to us anymore. And so actually the worst time to feel imposter syndrome is when a book is actually released, because, you know, as that famous saying goes, but novels never finish, they're only ever abandoned. So, you know, like there's no point worrying about the book once it comes out. It would just be what it is. And that's why I try and focus on the next thing, because I try not to worry too much about what the reception is, what the reviews are like, you know, how many Goodreads reviews has it got, how many Amazon reviews. Oh, I've got a 1-star review on Amazon because they meant to buy the audiobook and they accidentally bought the ebook, and therefore they then gave it a 1-star, and all that, you know, that kind of stuff can't enter into it. But it is hard, especially when you're on social media, to kind of keep that noise away, or kind of, you end up Googling yourself, or you end up like searching for your name on Twitter. Like, you know, we've all done it, whether we're all prepared to admit it in this webinar.
Totally guilty.
Actually, the first time I felt imposter syndrome was, I know it's quite a. So when my first short story was published in an anthology, this was back in 2005, 2006. It was in this anthology called Tell Tales, which was edited by Nee Ayikwe Parks and Rajiv Balasubramaniam, and it was a project that had been started by Nee and Korche Newland. And I remember going to a little celebration party because I was in volume 2, and so they had a little celebration party for all the volume 1 and volume 2 contributors, and being in a room with Korche Newland and Leonie Ross and Ramesh Gunasekar and all of these writers who I'd kind of really idolized for a really long time, and they were all talking to me like a peer. It just made me shrink. It just made me feel I shouldn't be here. I should not be in this room at all. This is the room. You know, this is the room, like as the Hamilton adage goes, this is the room where it happens, and I don't deserve to be in the room where it happens. And I feel like I've had that ever since. You know, not long after my first book came out, No, I think when my first novel came out, it was shortlisted for a prize, and because someone had blurbed the book, and then because they enjoyed it when they blurbed it, they called it in for a prize, which happens all of the time in publishing. There was like a news story.
Yes.
There was a news story written about me and this person, and because we were both Asian, it was just assumed that we were both friends, and that made me think I shouldn't be in this world. This world isn't for people like me, and I feel like at various points that sort of thing has just sort of followed me about. You know, just when I start to feel comfortable, I feel like I'm reminded that I don't belong in this world, and that's okay, because as the further I've got into my career, I've started to build what I feel like my world within the sphere of publishing should look like, and that's been really important to me.
That's very interesting. I do think, I mean, as I was researching people to come to sit on this panel, it seemed to me that most of the people who talked about having experienced imposter syndrome were either women or non-white people in some way. As soon as I talked to white men of a certain kind, it was like, what imposter syndrome? Why do we feel this? And I know this is anecdotal because I haven't approached as many people, but it does seem that we already have an inbuilt trigger for these feelings, because when people say, imagine a writer, even now, most people think of a white man. Do you feel the same about this, or is it just me kind of
No, I think it's absolutely
imagining?
right. And I think when you have imposter syndrome, one of the kind of triggers for it is looking around and thinking, are there any people like me? Do I belong here? And that's one of the things that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there, that you're an imposter, and I think when you did our intros, you touched on things like that, like a working class, or your ethnic background, or the fact you might have had mental health problems, or you're open about mental health problems. And I think if you look around an industry, whatever industry or job it is, and you don't see people who are like you, you subconsciously start to question whether you should actually be there or not. I mean, there are other triggers that personality types, like perfectionists are always going to feel imposter syndrome. People who don't like asking for help are always going to feel imposter syndrome. But I think the landscape, if it doesn't contain people like you, then it is a big trigger for feeling like you shouldn't actually be there.
So what's the most difficult aspect of it? How does it emerge for you? Because I know that this manifests in different ways for different people, and some people have it well under control, and some people are literally unable to function sometimes when imposter syndrome really strikes. So Emma, how do you manifest?
I think I worry about productivity, because my mental health actually sort of curtails that. So how many books I produce in, I don't know, space of 2 years, for example. And I was sort of quite okay at the beginning, and then became burnt out, and so it's slow at the moment. I also worry about sales, and I worry about awards, and I worry about the fact that I'm a newcomer to the nature writing sector, and I've come from a scientific background rather than a literary background. And it seems that the people who are very much respected in that field, in that sector, have come from the literary side of things. So all of those things swirl around in my head in a horrible cauldron.
And how do you respond to them?
Well, it's a good question. I try not to think about the sort of landscape of the nature writing field, because it is long established, it is much loved, and there's politics within it, and I can't really do a great deal about that. All I can do is write what I know has helped me, about the science that has helped me, and about how literally, what I see on my walks and how that lifts my mind. So I can't think about it much, and I just therefore sort of put it in a box. I peep into it sometimes and get all angst ridden, but it's in a box. In terms of sales, I try and sort of spread the word in a way where my followers, I suppose, on social media will sort of are able to go and see those things themselves, and so maybe that would echo what they can read about in my book. And I think the visual side of things is really compelling. So I use my photography whenever I can. And I don't know, it's not like I'm tweeting about my book all the time, but I suppose most of what I tweet about is related to how nature can improve your mental health. So that's all I can do. And so again, I try not to worry about it too much. And I just think, well, I'm sort of spreading that message as much as I can. And I've forgotten the third one.
It'll come back to you. Joanna, how does it manifest to you?
Oh, I spend a lot of time in toilets, I have to say, when I'm at events and things. Not because I'm unwell, just because I need to just breathe a minute, because I don't feel I should be there and I get anxious. So I'll just escape into a toilet cubicle for 5 minutes and just gather myself and remind myself I deserve to be there. But I think when you're writing, when you write a successful book, you are actually, as wonderful as it is, you are building yourself a gallows. Because you're sitting there thinking, can I do it again? Was that just a fluke? Am I just lucky? And when I wrote 3 things about Elsie, it was horrendous, because I just kept write, delete, not good enough, not good enough, not good enough. People aren't going to like this. And I started writing for the enjoyment of it. I started writing because I was stressed on the wards as a doctor and I wanted an escape. And I went to an event when I was writing Elsie and getting in a muddle. And a 15-year-old girl put her hand up in the Q&A and she said, "You used to write to escape the stress of the wards." I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Now that writing brings its own stress, what do you do to escape?" And I thought, oh my God, this girl is inside my head. And I thought, I've got to write the story I want to write, tell the story I want to tell in the way that I want to tell it, and not listen to this internal narrator who keeps telling me I'm not good enough. Because that's the problem, is you have this constant conversation with yourself all day that you're a load of crap. And from the minute you look in the mirror in the morning, you think, oh God, you look like such a pig. All the way through the day, you're telling yourself you're not good enough. And you're not even aware of it. But you're constantly reinforcing this negative imposter image that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And I think when you're giving feedback academically, when I was at uni, you were told to give, for every 1 piece of criticism, you have to give 5 pieces of positive feedback, or else the person will get disheartened. And if you think about how much negative feedback you give to yourself all day without any positive feedback at all, it's no wonder you feel like rubbish. So I try to think, well, this is a bad thought I'm having about myself. I acknowledge that thought. I'm not going to fight it. I acknowledge it. It's a normal thought. But I'm going to counterbalance that with something positive and remind myself of what I've achieved and not feel embarrassed about it. So that's what I try and do. But it is a work in progress, definitely.
That's very interesting, because I think everybody does experience this in different ways. And some of us think of it in terms as being directly related to the work we do. And with others, I think it's very much a social thing.
It's a personality type, I think. I think you're a certain personality type that constantly criticises yourself, because you're either a perfectionist or you're in an industry where there aren't people like you, or you don't like asking for help, and asking for help is a sign of failure, so you must be rubbish if you have to ask for help. So you go through the whole thing without asking for help. And I think it's this certain personality type that makes you into an imposter.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But I also think that it's that personality type that makes us writers in the first place.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely.
And I think that in some ways it's almost inevitable.
Yeah.
That this thing that we do and people's attitude to it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I get a lot of this. I mean, I actually realized that my imposter syndrome has meant that I haven't actually even introduced myself in this this panel. This is very typical of me. Okay, I'm Joanne Harris. I wrote a book called Chocolat, which some of you may have heard of. This book became a movie, which some of you may have heard of. And during the year that the movie came out, I was still officially a teacher. I was on a sabbatical. But I kind of experienced this meteoric rise, which I was completely unprepared for. And all the time that I was doing events and I was going to LA and I was going to premieres, I was thinking, what's a French teacher doing here? And I was absolutely convinced that at the back of a room somewhere, there would be some boy that I had taught at Leeds Grammar School putting his hand up going, "Excuse me, that's not a proper writer. That's Mrs. Harris. She used to teach me French." And I still feel this. And people find it very odd to think that I do still feel it, but it never goes away, this voice. For a whole year, I had a series of, I expect they were panic attacks. I didn't know at the time what they were. I just fainted, like Tony Soprano. Always in public, always in the most public situations you could think of. So glamorous premieres, royal palaces, you name it. If there were a lot of people there, I would pass out without a moment's notice. And after a while, it just went away. Because I think that kind of overload, and it must have been, it was a panic overload. I was having a good time on one level, but on another level, I felt that I wasn't supposed to be there. And so very literally and very physically, I would just disappear from the scene just by flaking out on the floor. And this must have happened maybe a dozen times. And I realize now that that's exactly what it was. It was my imposter syndrome saying basically, step away. I realize that that's quite an extreme example, but nothing that has happened in 20 years since then has really properly changed how I feel. So my question is, what do we do to cope apart from just telling ourselves that we shouldn't, which I've tried that and it doesn't really work.
No.
Nikesh, have you got any ideas on this? Have you a coping mechanism?
Yeah, so I think, so I had a book come out 4 years ago called The Good Immigrant that kind of, it changed my career, and it also became a book that was talked about at quite a national level and sort of put me in the spotlight in a way that was incredibly uncomfortable for me because, I'm a writer and I don't necessarily want to be seen as a public intellectual or speaker or thinker or what have you. And I was doing loads and loads of events, and it made me think a lot about purpose, what my purpose is, and as especially now in COVID times, I think a lot about what my purpose is. And I realized the impact that the book was having on young people of color who felt very marginalized in this country was much more important than the impact that the book was having on like very well-meaning liberals, or what impact the book was having on various media columnists. And so one of the ways that I sort of coped with the burden of having to constantly talk about race and racism, which was incredibly stressful and traumatic for me, was to kind of share the knowledge and share the platform and all of those things. So I just started mentoring writers. I am here. I am in the position I'm in because writers like Niven Govindan and Selena Godin and Courtney Newland and Nia Yikwe Parks took me under their wing at the right time in my career. And I remembered that when this book was doing what it was. And actually, I think getting out of my own head and sharing my knowledge and experience with other people. I mean, for the benefit that it has for me is that it reminds me that, regardless of what I think about myself, the people that I'm mentoring, they want to be where I am, and therefore I can share that knowledge and experience with them. But the most important thing is I'm giving something to the community that is completely invaluable. I'm giving them time and support and encouragement and networks and all the rest of it. And not enough of that is done in publishing because it's quite a solitary, strong silent type, soul lone hero warrior type of profession, and not like as collaborative as something like TV or film. I don't feel like people necessarily do as much mentoring work as they could be doing. It's great to be on this webinar with Joanna, because obviously the mentoring project that Kerry Hudson started was like one of the most amazing, incredible grassroots things that I've ever seen. And and Kerry is such an amazing individual, but and actually just seeing the impact that project had on so many different people across the industry, that all I can do is informally replicate it, or I helped to set up a literary agency and all the rest of it. So I feel like my way of coping is to try to externalize my anxiety into kind of generosity towards other people, in making the industry feel like it is a place that people who look like me can occupy. Because if there are more of us, I won't feel so weird at parties. I'll start going to parties again. I stopped going to parties after I was horrifically racially abused at a party, and I stopped going to all these literary events. If there are more people who kind of I feel like they're from the same background as me, I might start going again. I might start dipping my toe back into like the literary world or whatever we want to call it. But at the moment, it's just not for me. No, that's not me.
That's an awful thing to hear. I'm so sorry that happened. But I do hear it from a lot of people who feel that, you know, the literary world is not as welcoming as some people think it is. And it's great that you're doing mentoring and that you're able to extend this, because I do think that it helps enormously to know that you're not alone and to know that we can be connected to each other. And I think actually being online helps a lot. When I started off, there was no internet. And I had one friend in publishing, the author Chris Fowler, who I'd written to very, very early on in my career. And we started a correspondence. And I think, you know, I owe him enormous amounts of gratitude here, because just the fact that I had a correspondent who would write to me from time to time and tell me what he was doing, it completely helped to demystify this idea of the writing community that I had in my mind. And it helped enormously with confidence, and also to understand that this illusion of the literary world is not really what the literary world is like. It's not like, you know, a dozen people who all look the same sitting at some salon in London. We are actually much more diverse and much more connected than we think we are. Emma, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think my perception of the literary world, it still remains, actually, even though I'm now officially, I suppose, part of it. It seems to me to be something distant, mostly in London, mostly in fancy buildings, and that there are processes going on that are basically behind a veil. You know, the selling of rights and the fact that, you know, whether to have an agent or not, literary agents are operating in this other level that, and it does seem to me to be quite abstract and daunting and sort of slightly intimidating. And I still don't know a great deal about it. And I think my literary agent is Juliet Pickering, and she's been extremely patient with me, because I've come from, you know, I've got a sort of scientific mind, and I often will say, so what's happening with that then? And what's going to happen next? And I think she may at the beginning have been fairly surprised. I'm not sure whether she was surprised or not, but I was pestering her with, I'm desperate for information, because it just seemed to be incredibly mysterious. And of course, when you don't know about something, it's lack of knowledge that makes you anxious. And there's actually I'm just opening my phone because I made some notes. There's a term called pluralistic ignorance, where you're in a group of people who have or perhaps all in the same sector, like the literary world in a way, or just a group of authors, non-fiction or fiction, whatever. And we are all trying to succeed in our own tiny path. And we don't know a great deal about how the other people on their own paths are succeeding, or are gaining literary awards, or are gaining huge sales. And there are certain factors that we will never know about. But this pluralistic ignorance, apparently we can combat it literally by having conversations like this, by demystifying those processes. I think there's one or two books that actually explain for new authors or established authors what exactly goes on, because you pass over your script, your manuscript, and a great many processes go on, and that you can't see them, you're not witness to them, and then it'll come back and you've got some edits to do, and then there'll be basically a sales process of and maybe more than one publisher might be involved, and then you think, what? How is that even? Where is that happening? Is it happening in secret rooms? Are there bits of white smoke coming up? Who knows? It is
exactly, yes.
So much that we still don't know. And
yeah, I do think that's absolutely right. The idea that demystification is a big thing. I mean, that's why I did 10 Things About Writing. The idea that actually there are basic things which I didn't know when I started off, and I had to learn the hard way. And it would have been so nice if somebody actually explained what exactly it is that an agent does, apart from have lunches. How exactly does a book get made into a movie? What exactly is a first draft? Very, very important, all these things. And I think, the internet has many awful things going for it, but actually some of the good things is that they do allow people to ask these questions and to answer them. Yeah. We have come to a point where I think it would be quite nice to have questions from people. I've got some in chat, and you can put those in there. I've also got some that were sent to us in advance. Peter Reed is asking, can the panel come up with answers other than my customary no to the question, should I have heard of you? Which is directed to me when I say I'm a full-time writer. Boy, I feel that one. Nikesh, what do you think of that one? What do you say?
I treat that question with the contempt it deserves, because I sort of feel like, I don't know anything about you, fam. We just met. Like, I don't know how well read you are. I don't know if you read the type of stuff that I write. I don't even know if you've read a book that isn't Sapiens, because it's usually men who ask this question, and it's usually at a wedding when you're sat on that table, and there's always like that guy who like, oh, should I have heard of you? And you're like, I don't know what you read. So I always put the question back onto them. Like, I don't know what you think.
You know what?
It's a good one, Joanna.
What I always say is, if somebody says, have I heard of you? I do a Victoria Wood head tilt, and I go, are you a reader? Are you a reader? People are just, it's just a standard answer. Have I heard? Are you published? Are you self-published? How many books have you sold? And it's just like, you would never, like, I'd get asked how much money I earn. Does it pay well writing? How much money do you? I mean, you would never go and ask anybody in any other job, like, how much money do you earn every year? Are you paid well? Is it worth doing? But I think it's this attitude towards writing, as we were talking about earlier on, that is just, it's not given any kind of respect. It's seen as self-indulgence. So people feel perfectly able to ask things like, have I heard of you? How much money do you earn?
Yeah.
Can I just add to that, Joanna? Because I do a lot of school visits, because I write for teenagers, and teenagers always want to know how much money you earn, because they're just at that, they're often just at that stage where they're starting to think about what they want to do with their lives, and they are thinking about, you know, what is going to make me money and all the rest of it. And like the sad reality, like the sort of the weird thing about when someone's 14 and you're standing in front of them going, you should just care about the art, man. Like, it's not really going to inspire them. So I never know how, like, in school situations, I always dodge that question.
Yeah, that was good.
So when it comes to the Q&A bit, I always say, you know, now's the time for you to ask me questions. Please don't ask me how much money I earn, because the answer is really embarrassing. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be embarrassing for you or it's going to be embarrassing for me. And then we move on from it, and then no one ever asks me. But
it's great that you do schools. Do you do a lot of school stuff then? Do you do visits to schools in non-pandemic times?
Yeah, it's you know, the decision to move into writing YA was a targeted one, because I was a youth worker for so long, and I really, you know, youth work gave me so much in my life, and it gave me so much purpose. And when I sort of didn't, you know, when writing doesn't necessarily give me the time to be able to do a youth worker job in the same way, so going around and talking at schools was sort of a nice replacement for it. And
I think that is something that helps to kind of demystify writing and helps with imposter syndrome, doing things like talk to kids about writing. And as you said about earlier, the word mentoring thing that I benefited from is another thing that helps bust the myth. And I can remember when I did the word mentoring and HarperCollins wanted to buy Goats and Sheep, I actually said to my mum, oh, an editor at HarperCollins wants to buy Goats and Sheep, but I think she's just being kind. And that was my imposter syndrome. I thought Katie Espin at HarperCollins was being kind by buying my book.
She wasn't, though.
No,
I know her well. She wasn't being kind. No, but it's true. That's absolutely right. It's exactly the kind of tricks that our minds play on us. I have seen a number of people in the chats saying how they felt initially unable to join the SOA because of not feeling that they were a proper author. And I do think that there's something to be said here for joining a professional organization so that you've actually got something that says, yes, you're an author, because otherwise they wouldn't have let you join. And I do think that a lot of people feel relief when they realize that they are eligible, that, you know, yes, poets are eligible. Yes, illustrators are eligible, and screenwriters and non-fiction writers and self-published writers. And yes, you can join the Society of Authors. So that's actually one easy way of having just a little bit of objective validation, which allows you to say, yes, I'm an author because somebody else said so. We've got lots more questions. I have one from somebody whose name I've lost, I apologise, but who said, is there actually a good side to having imposter syndrome? Can you think of any benefits at all? Emma?
I think like any anxiety, to a certain level, it can spur you on. And I think if you're seeing other authors maybe in your field succeeding, or, you know, as I say, getting awards or being really well fated, and you look at their work and you think, oh, I'm worried about mine now. It can make you work harder. It can make you do more research. And so it is beneficial. It's a bit like having, I suppose, people in your class at school who are doing pretty well or whatever, and it can spur you on. I think also it makes you question fellow authors. It can make you, so I've reached out I don't like that phrase, sorry, apologize, but I've sort of messaged people or chatted to them and said, I'm a bit worried about this, and it's really mysterious. And then more often than not, fellow authors, or who are perhaps further down the line and perhaps they're less new than I am, will say, oh, don't worry, it's just this, you know, or don't worry about that, or go and talk to such and such. And so yes, I think it does have positive elements, spurs you on. And if it's getting a bit overwhelming, you either clam up, or if you're like me and you sort of, you know, chattering too much, you'll actually ask somebody some questions and pester them until you find out your answers in some way.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, what do you think?
No, I agree. I think it does spur you on. I always think the thing that almost breaks you, the character flaw you have that is you're kind of almost a downfall, is the thing that actually saves you. It's a double-edged sword. So my sensitivity as a doctor, which nearly finished me off, helps me to be a writer. And without that sensitivity, I wouldn't be able to write. And I think it's the same with imposter syndrome. I think, as Emma said, it does make you kind of work harder because you want to prove yourself to yourself. So it does make you strive for perfection, which can be a bad thing, but in moderation, I think it's good. And if I ever wake up one day and feel smug and big-headed about what I do, then I think it's time to stop, to be honest. It's finding that balance of not feeling like you don't belong, but feeling confident in yourself in a good way. The thing that really gets to me is when I'm doing, I don't know if any of you lot feel the same, when you're doing an event and you're being introduced and they talk about all your achievements. And I think, God, is that me? Like, did I?
And you want to sink into the ground.
And you're sitting there going, oh my goodness, like that. And I feel so cringe. And I think, no, be proud that you've done this.
Absolutely. I do think that's important. I've tried to say this online. I do YouTube tutorials. I do various things. And one of the tutorials that I've got is learning to accept that you are proud of what you've done and that you're allowed to be. I mean, obviously not all the time, because nobody normal goes around going, I'm wonderful all the time, but actually going, you know, I did this and it was pretty good and it's been pretty successful and I am proud of that. I think that women particularly are expected to feel modest and to be modest and to sort of, you know, I don't know, Nikesh, if you feel that you've been encouraged to be the same, this idea that actually going, I did this and it was pretty damn good is just beyond anything that you're allowed to do. But you know, other people celebrate their achievements. You know, if I run, I'm lousy at running. But the first time I ran a 5K, I told everybody I knew, and I said, I'm so pleased with this. And I'm absolutely not a runner. And it's not my imposter syndrome speaking here. It's the fact that I'm not a runner. But, you know, you're allowed to feel proud of that, but not of something that you do professionally that clearly other people believe in. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I grew up in a household where we didn't really celebrate the successes. We just hyperanalyzed failures, and that, you know, that's just the environment that I grew up in. But I think one of the things that allows me as a writer to keep showing up is my imposter syndrome, because I do think that there's a degree of vulnerability that imposter syndrome gives me, that I don't feel complacent when I sit down to to do what I'm doing. I don't feel like I'm not going to suddenly announce, I'm doing like the Great American Trilogy, despite being one of the most Mickey taken out of literary fiction authors of all time, like Jonathan Franzen. But he is someone who probably should read more Goodreads reviews. I'm only joking, but I do think that when you work on a novel, it is a solitary thing. You spend so much time in your own head and in your own world, or in a world of your own creation, that if you don't sort of give into that imposter syndrome, if you don't give into the vulnerability that affords you, then it won't allow you to dig deep when it comes to the writing. I really believe in that. I really think that vulnerability forces us to dig deeper.
No, I think that's a really good point. The idea that you can cut off your vulnerability and therefore not feel those awkward things. I think in some ways those are the things that are going to make you less good of a writer than if you actually embrace it and go, you know what, this makes me feel terribly awkward and vulnerable, but I am doing it anyway. And I mean, there are a number of people here talking about reading reviews and how awful it makes them feel. And, I'm here to tell you two things. One, it will always make you feel awful. I don't have a cure for that. I don't think any of us has a cure for that. But actually, it's one of the things that we have to learn to put aside, just going, okay, I made this. I put my all into it. I made it for you. I hope you like it, and then just step away from the whole reviewing situation. I don't know. Do you lot feel that you read your reviews? Do you read them? Do you get anything from them?
I read all
Do you
of them.
obsessively Google them?
All of them, everything. Yeah, it's a bad habit. I just can't. And I know Sarah Perry said once that not reading your reviews is like walking down a corridor, and there's rooms either side of you with all the doors open. People inside are saying horrible things about you. Of course, you'd go and listen, wouldn't you, to what they're saying about you? And that's what it's like reading reviews sometimes. But you just have to. I just have to anyway.
Yeah,
I can remember the lines of criticism from every bad review I've ever got, and they're the ones that keep me up at night, I think, because they're the ones that speak to something that's already within me. They've stayed with me because someone external has seen into my soul. When you're writing comedy, you're always told, like, a really great tip for writing comedy is to always know the worst thing that you could say to any of your characters. And I feel like those lines from those bad reviews are the worst things that someone could say to me, or that I would ever say about myself. And that's why they tend to keep me up at night. I really remember one that sort of said, while my novel was funny, it lacked maturity, and that was always my big worry, was that I never felt like a waiting, mature writer, and I will probably remember that for the rest of my career.
Do you remember the good ones though? Did you memorize any good ones?
No.
Oh, blimey!
Yeah, no.
No, I never remember the good ones. Emma, I know you went through a bit of a crisis because somebody criticised your silver work. And I know you were saying that it made you feel like, you didn't want to do any anymore. And I was thinking, but all the people who've said all the great things about it, is that connected too?
I think, that was tough because it was an absolute, it's like a 0 stars out of 5. And that was 4 years ago. And I just did not feel I could make things to sell anymore, and that had been I'd been selling jewelry that I'd made for 18 years at that point. I used to do it sort of on the side alongside my other job, which was technology science based. I was like a tech business consultant, and that was the way that I chilled out. And so it was a piece of it was something that had helped my mental health for a huge amount of time. And I'm always open about the fact that my pieces aren't perfect. They're not that, I'm not trying to aim for H. Samuel sort of cookie cutter. Every piece I make is different, and then there'll be slight wibbles and wobbles around it. But that's how it is. And this person really took offense at that. But when I've looked at it in retrospect, a little bit later, in recent months, I've sort of looked back at her email. I had it in a sort of folder where I couldn't see it. I didn't want to look at it. It could have been that there was another motive there. I'm not entirely sure, but also she just didn't like my style, and that's okay. But unfortunately, when it comes so personal, and it's not just sort of far distant in a paper or on Goodreads or whatever, it was in my inbox, aimed at me like a paper plane made of, darts of pain. Yeah, it was hard. So then I tentatively put some photos of what I'd been making just as experiments. But, I always have this horrible thing in my head, those who can't teach. So I've been teaching these workshops for a decade, 4 years of which I've not been selling alongside. And so I've been doing some experiments in my workshops, just saying, well, hey, maybe we can cast these things, or bring everything you can with you that you've got on nature walks, or from your garden, I started casting really interesting things like dragonfly wings and feathers, and just to see if it worked. It was literally my version of experimentation, because I used to work in a lab. I was doing a PhD when my mental health became too severe, and then so I just put some photos on Twitter, and the response was astonishing.
It was, wasn't it? There was such a lot of support. I think, if we can try, all of us, to surround ourselves by people who are not going to feed into these toxic thoughts and who will support us, and also accept that, tastes differ and we can't please everybody. And the more we please people, the more likely we are to access people who we don't please, the better, really. I don't think that there's an answer to this, but there is certainly something to be said in being more connected, to reach out to people and just admitting that, we're all making it up as we go along. None of us have been gifted the magic wand in any way. We are reaching the end of our time, I'm afraid. I could have gone on with this a long time. Thank you so much, all of you, for this. Thank you, Nikesh, Joanna, Emma. Thank you, Sophia, for moderating all this. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Last time I looked, there were 400 odd people, and from all over the world. It's wonderful to see so many people tuning into this. Tomorrow we have a Social Media for Poets event with poets Katrina Naomi, Miriam Nash and Jacob Samler-Rose, who will discuss how poets use or could use social media in this session chaired by Rishi Dastidar, a poet and editor. We won't be having our afternoon tea this session because it's our AGM, followed by our panel discussion, Imagining 2021, the Future for Writers and Creators. Panelists will include Philip Jones of The Bookseller, Charmaine Lovegrove from Dialogue Books, literary agent Isabel Dixon, and broadcaster Alan Dane. It's going to be chaired by children's author Candy Goulet. Our next afternoon tea is on the 26th of November with Margaret Atwood and is in conjunction with the Writers' Union of Canada. Head to Society of Authors to book, and I think the moderator is going to post that in chat as well in a minute. Recordings of our festival are available. Again, the link is in chat. It's been wonderful being here. Thank you. Let's continue this conversation on Twitter. The festival hashtag is SOA@home. It's been great being here. I hope I see you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.